This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
Thank you very much. I'm going to speak about literature, so it's going to be quite a different paper. I'm going to speak about a novel with the title Lagerfeuer, which means campfire. Lagerfeuer is a novel that portrays in-betweenness in a geographical, ideological, and existential sense. It is set in the transit camp in Berlin-Marienfelde, where the characters have been placed after leaving the German Democratic Republic, East Germany, for West Germany, the Federal Republic of Germany. The paper will focus on the characters of the East German single mother Nelly Senf and her two children Katja and Alexei, and it will explore how motherhood is played out in a situation of displacement. After fleeing, emigrating, migrating from East Germany to West Germany, many former East Germans, including the novel's author Julia Franck, as a young child, were placed in this. It's actually, the literal translation is emergency, accession camp or something like that. It's a little tricky to translate. The migration from East to West Germany, of course, represents a very particular situation when compared to other instances of migration. And the fact that it's difficult to choose an appropriate terminology shows the peculiarity of the German migration. The novel Lagerfeuer was first published in 2003, and to my knowledge there is no English translation. Julia Franck has published 3 further novels since, and she won the German Book Prize in 2007 for Die Mittagsfrau, which is published in the UK as The Blind Side of the Heart. I mean, we can say she's a well-established German novelist. In this paper, I will use some of my work on the domestic sphere and on motherhood in exile, gained from my work on German-speaking women writers who emigrated from Germany and Austria to Britain in the 1930s to flee from the Nazi regime. The mother and grandmother of Nelly Senf in Lagerfeuer are shown to be German-speaking Jewish refugees, and thus there is a link between these two different instances of migration and exile. This fact is revealed in the first chapter of the novel. Nelly Senf is facing hostile questioning from the East German border guards, who asked her about her marital status. Nelly has 2 children, but she was never married to the children's Russian father, who has since committed suicide. And we learn that her mother was not married either. Nelly's mother was Jewish, and Nelly's father was not. So they were not allowed to marry according to the National Socialist race laws. Her father died, and I quote, while returning from exile, and her mother then returned to Berlin while pregnant with the character Nelly. I will try and focus on the 4 research questions that you all have in your pack. I will try 4 out of the 12 or so. So I'm going to try and focus on question 8. How are the issues affecting migrant and exiled mothers specifically being theorized and approached within different disciplines? And I will attempt a comparison between the post-1968 exile literature and the exile literature of the 1930s and 40s. And I will try and show how literary criticism, and especially feminist literary criticism, has theorized exiles. We will also talk about how motherhood has been a neglected area. I will also talk about question 10. What kinds of literary techniques and effects are employed? And I will discuss the portrayal of everyday life as one of the literary techniques to convey this situation of a mother in exile. And question 11, what insights can literary narrative and representations offer this discussion? And my analysis will mainly offer a discussion across the several different periods of 20th century German literature. I'm also interested in the final question, and that's now the only paper this morning that focuses on literature. What kinds of relationship are there between literature and real life? I'm not sure if I can answer it, but you know. According to the Swiss academic Elisabeth Bronfen, the literary discussion of exile is located in the tension between reality and metaphor. The discussion of exile as a metaphor has many well-known advocates within literary criticism. The French critic Julia Kristeva, for example, states in her essay, A New Type of Intellectual, the dissident, that, and I quote, "Writing is impossible without some kind of exile." Andrew Gore's Writers in Exile charts exile as the central theme of modern literature. He claims that, and I quote again, "Exile creates the kind of isolation which is the nearest thing to freedom that a 20th century writer is likely to attain." Two paradigms are regularly cited for this metaphorical origin of exile. Firstly, it derives from the biblical story of Genesis and the expulsion from paradise. Secondly, it originates from the Oedipus myth. Using Ovid, Dante, and Victor Hugo as examples for the prototype of the literary exile, the uprooted, estranged writer is seen by some as an ideal type of the modern writer. Michael Seidel argues in his study Exile and the Literary Imagination, which focuses on a critical reading of a small number of literary texts that, and I quote, "Imaginative powers begin at the boundaries of accumulated experiences," and that exile is not only the, quote, "symptomatic metaphor for the narrative imagination, but also its material resource." So can we follow Elisabeth Bronfen in an attempt to show the interrelationship of the reality-directed discourse of exile and the universalizing discourse of exile? She shows in her essay Entordnung und Identität, haven't translated that, you can ask me later, how the exiled writer can create a new narrative out of the reality of loss, but how at the same time she can use it as a critical position to show the limits of this authority of experience. What then about the women writers writing about exile and the feminist discourse? Jane Marcus, in her article Alibis and Legends, The Ethics of Elsewhereness, Gender and Estrangement, states that, and I quote, "Feminism is a natural medium and method for the examination of exile. For, in its explicit articulation of otherness, it places the critic in the position of exile, aware of her own estrangement from the center of her discipline, awkwardly measuring just how much marginalization she is willing to bear, negotiating dangerous identifications with her subject, edgingly balancing on boundaries and testing limits." Now, the study of women exiles from National Socialism and many other groups of women who had to flee their countries since has shown that there's nothing simple about the further condition of exile they had to endure besides their existence in a patriarchal society. A feminist reading of exile literature will need to understand the multiple displacements of women's authors' lives and their texts, acknowledging that, and I quote again, "displacement and distance are obviously different for women, which are already displaced by gender within their home culture." Now, Emilia von der Lühe draws on feminist literary theory and feminist attention to the everyday and domestic space for her understanding of the work of Anna Gmeiner, a writer which I have also worked on, coining the term, in inverted commas, poetics of everyday life to describe Anna Gmeiner's radical discourse. Jane Marcus argues that the creation of a new identity and a new home is politically and intimately bound up with domestic labor, and that exile or exilic art can be seen as homemaking. There's an obvious danger of essentializing the domestic sphere as female or feminine in this approach, however much we might welcome the discussion on motherhood and exile. Motherhood and the domestic sphere in exile are little discussed topics, in my opinion. Certainly within the sort of field of literature of the 1930s and 40s. I think it probably continues in contemporary literature, but again, we can discuss this. And two writers who did focus on motherhood are the writers Anna Segers and Anna Gmeiner. Anna Segers was in the 30s and 40s exiled to France and Mexico, and she's the author of numerous works either written in exile or with an exile theme, the most famously The Seventh Cross, which was published in 1942, and Transit, published in 1944. Anna Gmeiner was exiled to France and Britain in the 30s and 40s, and she's the author of Magna, published in 1938, and Café du Dôme, published in 1941. Now, Anna Segers wrote an essay on mothers and children in exile, where she outlines how mothers in exile find the strength to support their family. And I quote, "From the first moment, the woman, wife, same word in German, will try to establish a household in the tiny hotel room with the cooking area." But in this sentence, she implicitly states that, or Seger implicitly states that this woman's activity is supporting and definitely not political. And I quote again, these are my translations. "In Paris, she's not politically active again, despite the fact that her husband is spending all his time with his comrades. But often she feeds at least one of them as well. So's men's if asked." So here, the domestic sphere is clearly important, and it is also very important in Lagerfeuer, in Julia Franck's Lagerfeuer. For example, Franck does not like the fact that the communal kitchen in the camp is inadequate and that she and her children have to eat in a canteen. She complains, again, my translations, "The kitchen was so dirty as if I had not cleaned it from top to bottom yesterday." And another quote, "Your children do not eat at your table anymore. Then you're not creating a home for them, maybe still theoretically, but not in practice." Now Segers, exile of the 30s, 40s, Segers describes how children attempt to integrate themselves in school. Here idealizing clearly with ideological undertones. Segers was also a communist. I quote, "For the first time he, the boy, stands with gritted teeth in the corner of the school playground. Running boys nudge him by accident or deliberately, stare at him nosily or with complete indifference. But the following will happen today, tomorrow, or maybe on the day after tomorrow. One of the boys will come over to him, and his dark eyes unmistakably the light of solidarity. In the dark sky of this world in which his mother has borne him, the sun sees the stars for the first time." Now in Lagerfeuer, Nelly Senf's children experience at school is not positive. Both Katja and Alexei find it hard to integrate into the school community. They feel they do not have the required branded school bags and toys, and that they are not invited to birthday parties. The 8-year-old Alexei is bullied systematically and is physically attacked by his classmates, ending up seriously injured in hospital. His mother is portrayed as concerned, but not, as we might expect, emotionally overwhelmed by the situation. And interestingly, she's unwilling to condemn the bullies. Nelly acknowledges the difficulties the classmates have in her son's school, namely that they have to get used to pupils from this camp frequently, who then tend to disappear quickly again. Only in a conversation with the doctor at the hospital, who clearly blames Nelly Senf for her son's situation, the reader is confronted with more extreme emotion. I quote, "As if I would let my children go hungry, or as if I neglected them." Overall, however, Nelly's calm attitude as a mother, they show her as a very strong character. In fact, it is clear from the beginning of Lagerfeuer that being a mother makes Nelly more vulnerable in her in-between situation to pressure from those in power. We are told about her past as a research chemist who worked for the East German Academy of Sciences until 1976, when she submitted her application to leave the GDR. After that, we learned that she lost her job and she had to work as an unqualified gardener in a Berlin cemetery, interestingly the Jewish cemetery. After submitting an application to leave the GDR, it wasn't uncommon that people would receive threats that their children might be taken into care. Now, this threat was, as far as I could find out, only carried out in a minority of cases, but the threat that Nelly might lose custody of her children is also alluded to in Lagerfeuer. The long first chapter shows the border crossing of the family. On the East German side of the border, the children are separated from their mother and questioned on their own. Nelly is shown to imagine the worst case scenario, how her children are not able to answer the questions, how they might get spirited away through an underground tunnel to a Stasi prison. When the children reappear, they seem completely unimpressed by the situation, even though they had to undress and leave their second set of underwear behind. They were made to wear the second set so they could sort of take more clothes across from East Germany to West Germany. It's quite interesting. Anyway, the children are unimpressed, but Nelly herself is far more agitated by her questioning and also by the gynecological examination that followed the question. She is relieved when she's reunited with her children and finally able to cross the border. But it's not only on the East German authorities that use her position as a mother to pressure her to conform to their aims. Later in the novel, after having already spent several months in the camp, she's questioned by a mysterious character, a Herr Dr. Rothe. He tries to pressure Senf to acknowledge her position as a victim of the GDR regime, and he promises her financial advantages. When she's not willing to agree with him, he threatens her by referring to her position as a mother. I assume you enjoy the responsibility as a mother and carry out your duties to the maximum of your capabilities and your conscience. He alludes that it is irresponsible of her not to agree to his offers, but then she doesn't change her mind. The Austrian Jewish writer Anna Gmeiner, exiled in the 30s and 40s, was far more radical than Anna Segers regarding the transformatory potential of motherhood. Domestic and everyday life is important in her novels, but it is not used as something that keeps women in a traditional feminine sphere. In Manya, for example, the bodily aspect of motherhood is expressed. There's a scene where one mother breastfeeds a baby that is not her own, a differently racialized newborn baby. So it's basically a German Aryan mother breastfeeding a Jewish baby. In Café du Dôme, the main character, Nadia, she becomes pregnant, and as she's fed up with her partner, who incidentally spends all his time with his comrades and then turns out to be a Nazi spy, she decides to become a single mother. And solidarity between women is expressed explicitly when her friends encourages her. And I quote, "Don't give it up, Nadia. It belongs to us alone. It's our business, not theirs." In Lagerfeuer, Senf is a single mother, and her strength lies in her pragmatism and her ability to deal with this in-between situation. In Lagerfeuer, it is the male characters who cannot cope. For example, a character, Hans Pischke, who's not left the camp for 13 months. In fact, he only moves forward when he's united with his daughter Doreen, who he had never met. Again, parenthood seems to have a transformatory power. Another character, Vladislav Jablonska, he is an unpleasant man who sort of spouts sexual innuendo and lies in bed all day and doesn't really do anything. And even the American interrogator, John Bird, seems to suffer from some sort of arrested development. He seems very weak and stuck in this in-between situation. Yeah, one more minute. Okay. Christina Jablonska is incidentally the only one who does leave the camp. I've already talked about, Lagerfeuer also mentions the female body a lot. Motherhood is able to transform. At the end of the novel, Nellie takes her children for Christmas dinner in the camp canteen. And for her, the situation seems dynamic. So, though she still lives in the camp, and the Christmas dinner isn't this fake, harmonious sort of family occasion. Her children defy expectations when asked to recite poetry, and therefore expose the adults in charge to ideological ridicule. Finally, the Christmas tree goes up in flame. The novel's title, Lagerfeuer, Campfire, is clearly connected to this ending. Obviously, the term normally relates to the situation where people sit around a fire outdoors, and this situation is often romanticized in German literature. Here we are looking at the non-romantic situation of the Notaufnahmelager, an emergency camp. But I would argue by not resolving the in-between situation, Julia Franck plays a useful game with the tension between exile as a reality and exile as a metaphor. The interesting aspects lie in between. What the reader is sure about is that Nellie will continue her effort as a mother for her children. I believe portraying in-betweenness, Franck demystified certain aspects of exile and motherhood. Franck does not console the reader with a stable ending where the family finds a permanent home. It would be fascinating to discuss this further regarding to different literatures and maybe different disciplines. What I hope I've been able to show are the parallels across the different instances of exile historically in Germany and how they are portrayed in literature. Motherhood has served, in my paper, as a common aspect for investigation, and the portrayal of everyday life has proven to be a common literary technique. Thank you very much.